So after the occupation of Rhineland in 1936, 1937 was a relatively quiet year diplomatically, but the next area of expansion that Hitler was looking to was Austria. So Austria is on the map here in the dark red. Hitler obviously himself was Austrian. Hitler had said in 1925 in Mein Kampf that his ambition was to unite Germany and Austria as one country. And so it's not surprising perhaps that by 1938 Hitler felt strong enough to begin trying to initiate this union between Austria and Germany. He put pressure on Austria itself was ruled by a quasi-fascist dictator called Kurt Schuschnigg. Hitler and Schuschnigg was trying to suppress the Nazis within Austria who were trying to overthrow him. Basically, Hitler insisted that Schuschnigg allow him to intervene in Austrian elections. Schuschnigg arranged a referendum on Austrian independence in early 1938, and the way the referendum was worded, it was obvious that a majority of Austrians would vote in favour of retaining Austrian independence, and basically Hitler insisted that Schuschnigg cancel the referendum and resign, or Germany would invade Austria, and Schuschnigg decided he had no choice. He resigned. The Austrian Nazis took over, and as a result, Anschluss, or the union of Austria and Germany, was achieved in early 1938. And as you can see in the map, this is obviously bad news for Czechoslovakia in particular, because it's now surrounded on at least half the country surrounded by Nazi Germany. Which brings us to our next Jeopardy question. So the part of Czechoslovakia demanded by Hitler in 1938, named after mountains in Bohemia. And the answer you should have is, what is the Sudetenland? So the area highlighted here, it's the part of Czechoslovakia that is on the periphery of the north, west and south. That was the Sudetenland. That was mostly populated by German speakers. German speakers were a large minority there. And starting in the spring of 1938, Hitler began demanding that the German speakers in Czechoslovakia be given political autonomy. The Czechoslovakian government refused. And this helped raise a crisis basically across Europe, because France was committed to an alliance with Czechoslovakia. If Czechoslovakia was invaded, France in theory would attack Germany in support. And the British government was concerned because even though they did not want to fight a war for Czechoslovakia, their military planners had calculated that if a war broke out between France and Germany, that Germany would win that war if France did not have British help, and that would detrimentally alter the balance of power in Europe against British interests. So in other words, the British would have had no choice but to join the French in attacking Czechoslovakia. The British Prime Minister at this time was, well, let's see if you guys know, he was the British Prime Minister who immediately preceded Winston Churchill. And the answer is, who is Neville Chamberlain. So for the British, there was an obvious solution to this problem. That is the problem of potential war over Czechoslovakia. Basically, the French needed to renounce their commitment to Czechoslovakia and essentially abandon Czechoslovakia. And Chamberlain put pressure on Edouard Daladier, who we came across in the previous class, the Prime Minister of France from 1938 to 1940, to do just that, to literally abandon the Czechs. Daladier refused. His mindset was, and I'm going to have a slightly long quote here so you guys get an insight into this. Hitler's ultimate goal was, and quoting Daladier here, a domination of the continent in comparison with which the ambitions of Napoleon were feeble. Today it is the turn of Czechoslovakia. Tomorrow it will be the turn of Poland and Romania. When Germany had obtained the oil and wheat it needs, she will turn on the West. Certainly we must multiply our efforts to avoid war, but that will not be obtained unless Great Britain and France stick together, intervening in Prague for new concessions, but declaring at the same time that they will safeguard the independence of Czechoslovakia. If, on the contrary, the Western powers capitulate again, they will only participate in the war they wish to avoid. So for Daladier, this was frankly, and certainly in hindsight, was correct to have a much bigger picture view of this than Chamberlain, that Czechoslovakia would simply be another domino that would not sate Hitler's territorial demands. By the summer of 1938, Hitler was no longer not just demanding autonomy for the Sudetenland Germans, he was demanding that Czechoslovakia cede the areas of the Sudetenland directly to Germany. And this was an enormous problem for the Czechs because the Sudetenland area was firstly the largest industrial part of Czechoslovakia. Also because it was a mountainous region, it was very vital for Czechoslovakian defence against a German attack. So to turn these areas over to Germany would make Czechoslovakia a lot poorer and a lot weaker and unable to defend itself. And as tensions rose, as Hitler refused to back down, by September 1938, it seemed to everyone that war was inevitable, that Germany would invade Czechoslovakia, France would then have to attack Germany in turn, and the United Kingdom would then have to come to the aid of France to prevent it being defeated by Germany. But in late September 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain made one last effort to try and stave off war. He flew to Munich, pictured here, where he would meet with Mussolini and Hitler, and the fourth guy in the picture to the left of Chamberlain, that was simply a translator, to hammer out a deal. And basically what the deal was, Chamberlain agreed that the Sudetenland would be given to Germany, Czechoslovakia would turn it over. The Czechs were obviously furious with this deal. They felt that it would ensure that, essentially that Germany would invade it anyway. What would it stave off? This was a humiliation. But they felt they had no choice, because Chamberlain was indicating the British would not support the Czechs if they refused to accept. The French really did not like the deal, but because the British were saying they would not intervene if Czechoslovakia went to war over it, France felt it had no choice but to accept these terms as well. So not popular with the Ladier, but it was actually popular with a lot of people at the time. So this didn't age well. When Neville Chamberlain returned home from his meeting with Hitler in 1938, he declared he had achieved this. The famous quote you guys should know is, "What is peace in our times?" And here's the famous scene of Chamberlain coming back with the agreement with Hitler. And yeah, obviously in hindsight this looks bad. Chamberlain obviously comes off looking quite foolish here. But at the time these ideas were very, very popular, certainly within the United Kingdom in particular. It was felt that Chamberlain had, Hitler had said this was his last territorial demand. It seemed that Chamberlain had rescued peace from the jaws of war, and was quite popular. The Ladier comments in his journal that he flew back to France and he expected to be heavily criticised by the French people, and he was frankly astonished that many people in France openly celebrated the deal as well. Let's take a quick look at Czechoslovakia. So the area in yellow is the Sudetenland that was ceded in September 30, 1938. But the Italians and the Germans continued to put pressure on Czechoslovakia. They forced the Czechs to turn over the red area in red to Hungary in October 1938. And then Poland took advantage of this to seize a little bit the area in blue from Czechoslovakia in November 1938. So Czechoslovakia essentially was getting dismembered by the various powers of Europe, and the British and French were kind of unable to do much to help it. So Czechoslovakia in the fall of 1938 is very much on life support. But back in France, a lot of people were kind of content with this achievement. What Leon Blum described as a cowardly sense of relief and shame. That is, yes, obviously people of France understood that this was wrong, that the Czechoslovakian state had been badly let down by its British and French allies, but people were content by the fact that it had avoided war. And this led to a phenomenon in French society, or a new coining of a word, the Munichois. That is, the people who supported the treaty at Munich. So a public opinion poll taken at the time indicated that 57% of French people supported the Munich Agreement, hence they being the Munichois, and 37% opposed it. Perhaps more importantly, however, 70% felt this should be the last concession to Adolf Hitler, and that no more concessions should be made after this. The Munichois was kind of divided by, it kind of cut across all different classes and political creeds. There were certainly socialists who kind of still maintained a traditional socialist policy of pacifism in general and trying to avoid war at all costs. And then there were kind of French fascists who, for different reasons, were glad a deal had been done with Hitler, and kind of welcomed this as an achievement for Adolf Hitler. One of the most extraordinary things of this was Pierre-Etienne Flandin, who we saw earlier on, who was the Prime Minister at the Stresa Front in 1935. He telegraphed Adolf Hitler to congratulate him on his great victory, his great success at Munich. And Flandin, you won't be surprised to hear, ends up working with the German government when they invade France in the 1940s. So there was a divide in French society between those who were kind of horrified by this deal, particularly the Communist Party, again under orders from the Soviet Union to take steps to make sure France was on a war footing with Germany, and others who accepted the kind of inevitability of this, some out of a sense of resignation and some out of a sense of admiration for Adolf Hitler. The big concern for the French state after the Munich conference was trying to get some kind of, forgive me one second, my computer is gone, was trying to get some commitment from Britain. The attitude of the French government was that the British government had been far too casual in terms of not committing itself openly to an alliance with France if and when war came with Germany. And Daladier was actually quite concerned that he told the American ambassador to France in 1939, a guy called Bullitt, that he fully expected the United Kingdom to sell out France as it had in 1935 when it made a deal with the Germans about naval powers. He said to the American ambassador Bullitt, England had become so feeble and senile that the British would give away every possession of their friends rather than stand up to Italy and Germany. And so the concern for the French government in 1939 was trying to get a public commitment from the British that they would support the French in a war against Germany. To the extent to which Daladier encouraged his foreign minister, George Bonnet, to open some talks with the Germans towards a possibility of a treaty of friendship with them. Not that he really intended on following through with it, but to send a signal to the British that you kind of need to openly declare your alliance with us now. The French also engage in an act of espionage or kind of subterfuge here. They spread rumours that the Nazis were planning on invading the Netherlands in 1939 to use as a potential bombing base against the United Kingdom. And when the British government inquired to the French who had actually created this rumour, whether the French would help the Netherlands if the Germans invaded, the French said they would, so long as the British made a public proclamation that they would support the French if and when a war came. And this ruse largely succeeded. In February 1939, the British government said, and this is Neville Chamberlain, the solidarity that unites France and Britain is such that any threat to the vital interests of France must bring about the cooperation of Great Britain. That is, that France kind of got the cooperation they wanted and felt that they could be in a better position to stand up to the Germans going forward. Not that any of this helps Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, Hitler kind of did what he had obviously been threatening to do for some time, invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, completed the conquest, and essentially very openly broken his word, and now became very obvious that he could not be trusted anymore and that his territorial ambitions had not been sated. All attention then turned to Poland. Poland, so the city of Danzig had traditionally been a German city. It had been placed under League of Nations administration in 1919 as a kind of free city. And also the Polish corridor, as you can see here, had cut Germany in two, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Now Hitler began to make noises, even though Hitler had actually signed a treaty with Poland recognizing the Polish border in 1934, that guaranteeing the border, that now Poland demanded that Poland turn over Danzig and give up some of the Polish corridor at least, so that Germany could be properly united. This concerned obviously the four powers in Eastern Europe. Britain and France were trying to work a deal with the Soviet Union to make them a more formal allies of Britain and France. The issue was Poland. In February 1939, the British government had openly said if Germany attacks Poland, the British government will come to the aid of Poland. And Daladier felt that was a mistake because he felt that once the Poles had a British guarantee, they would not cooperate with the Soviet Union. In particular, the idea was, would Soviet troops be allowed to enter Poland if war broke out with Germany? The Poles, understandably, were not very keen on that idea. But they felt they did not have much, or they felt with British backing they could reject that possibility, and that really kind of broke down the relationship between the British, the Soviets, and the French. Because if the Russians could not enter into Poland, then they really couldn't offer any effective assistance in a war with Germany. Nevertheless, so France was not overly key. I mean, France actually felt pretty angry at Poland for the role it had played in kind of dismembering Czechoslovakia. But nevertheless, Daladier was very adamant that if and when war came, and I quote Daladier here, France intended to stand by the Poles, and if Hitler should refuse to negotiate with the Poles over Danzig and should make war on Poland, France would fight at once. So Late 1939, a conflict over Poland is emerging, but Daladier is publicly stating that the French will stand with the Poles if and when the Germans invaded.